The night my father introduced me to his largest client as our daughter. She teaches elementary school. He paused just long enough to let the word elementary do its work. I was 31 years old. I had a master's degree, a classroom of 26 second graders I'd spent 7 years showing up for every single morning, and a boyfriend named Weston who'd driven 4 hours to be there. My father didn't mention any of that. He said elementary school the way you'd say still figuring things out, and then steered the conversation back toward my brother before the client could ask a follow-up question. Weston caught my eye from across the room. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The Hartley family built its reputation on commercial real estate. My grandfather started with a single strip mall in Scottsdale in 1974, and my father turned that into Hartley Property Group. 12 employees, a corner office in downtown Phoenix, and an annual gala that the local business community actually calendared in advance. The kind of event where people wore things they bought specifically for the occasion and made sure to arrive after the first 15 minutes, so they weren't the ones standing near the door when the important guests walked in. My brother Drew had been working for my father since he graduated from ASU. He handled acquisitions. He had a card with the HPG logo on it, and his name in embossed print, and a parking spot in the garage with his name on a little sign. I knew about the parking spot because my father mentioned it at Thanksgiving. Drew finally got his spot, he'd said, like that meant something I was supposed to understand. I was not on that kind of trajectory, and everyone in my family had made peace with that in their own way, which mostly involved not discussing it. My mother's version was efficiency. Whenever someone at church or at the club asked about me, she said I worked with children, left a small smile hanging in the air, and moved on. The smile was the punctuation. It said, sweet, but not remarkable. She'd been using that smile since I told her at 22 that I'd been accepted to the master's program in education at Northern Arizona instead of the MBA program in Tempe that my father had quietly assumed I'd pursue. He hadn't said much that night. He looked at the paperwork I'd brought to show him, and then set it down on the kitchen counter and said, "Well, you've always done things your own way." That was 8 years ago. I had since done the following: earned my master's, taught second grade at Crestview Elementary for 7 consecutive years, been named my school's Teacher of the Year in my 4th year, and in March of the year before the gala, led a district-wide literacy initiative that brought reading proficiency rates in our lower-income schools up 11 percentage points in a single academic year. The Arizona Department of Education sent a letter. My principal framed a copy and put it in the hallway. My parents knew about the award because I'd texted the announcement to the family group chat. My father reacted with a thumbs-up emoji. My mother sent a heart. My brother wrote "Congrats, sis," and then someone changed the subject to Drew's new truck. I kept the letter from the Department of Education in my kitchen drawer for a while, not because I'd given up on wanting them to care, but because I'd gotten quieter about it. Like a house where you stop opening certain windows because the draft they let in isn't worth it. Weston came into my life about 14 months before the gala. I met him at the farmer's market near my apartment on a Saturday in October. I'd stopped at a booth selling hand-ground coffee, the kind where someone explains the elevation of the farm before they'll let you smell the bag, and he was behind me in line holding a reusable tote with a broken handle he'd fixed with a zip tie. We ended up talking for 40 minutes. He asked me about my work before he asked me anything else. And when I told him about a student I'd had that week, a 7-year-old who'd arrived in my class speaking almost no English in September and had just read his first complete sentence aloud without help, Weston went quiet for a moment, and then said that sounded like the kind of thing that would carry you through a hard week. I noticed things about him gradually. He dressed simply. He drove a 10-year-old Subaru with a dented rear bumper. He was careful with money in the way people are when they've had to be, not in the way people perform when they want you to notice. But there were small inconsistencies that didn't quite line up. A phone call he took on the back porch one evening, speaking in complete, formal sentences I recognized from the sound of them as the kind of sentences you use with a board. A folder on his coffee table labeled with an acronym, SVF, and the date 3 weeks out. When I asked, he said it was a nonprofit thing, nothing interesting. I let it go. He looked at me the way someone looks when they've decided you're worth paying attention to, not because of what you might become, but because of what you already are. That was not a small thing. My parents knew I was seeing someone. My mother's full inquiry, delivered over the phone while she was clearly also unloading groceries, was, "Is he in finance or real estate?" "No," I told her, "he does land work." "Development?" "Not exactly. Conservation." A pause. The particular pause she uses when she's recalibrating. "Well, that's very admirable." She said it the way people say how unique when they mean I have no follow-up questions. That was the entire conversation. 14 months, summarized in 40 seconds while she put away yogurt. My brother Drew's promotion party was the gala in question. My father had rebranded it as a company milestone celebration, 15 years of HPG, but everyone understood it was primarily an occasion to announce that Drew was being made a partner. There were 200 guests at the Arizona Biltmore, in one of the smaller ballrooms that was still too large for the occasion and made the whole thing feel even more official for it. A string quartet. A signature cocktail named the HPG Old Fashioned. Engraved programs. I found out about the seating arrangement 12 days before the event, not because anyone told me, but because I'd been helping my mother address envelopes, one of those tasks I'd agreed to out of habit and mild guilt, and I saw the table chart spread across her office desk when I went in to refill my water. Table 17. Near the back, near the hallway that curved toward the kitchen. Weston's name was printed on a generic white card beneath mine in the same font they used for the parking validation stickers at the front. Tables 1 through 4 had place cards in a dark cream stock with the guests' names handwritten in a calligraphy script, small sprigs of dried eucalyptus beneath each one. My father's most important contacts, his 2 oldest friends from the industry, Drew and his girlfriend, and at table 1, next to my father, Garrett Sloan. Garrett Sloan was the managing director of Western Apex Capital, one of the largest commercial investment funds operating in the Southwest. His firm had been in preliminary conversations with HPG for 7 months. The deal, if it closed, would have been the largest in my father's career. My father had mentioned Garrett Sloan's name at every family dinner for the past 3 months, each time with the particular reverence he reserved for people he wanted something from. I stood at my mother's desk for a long moment looking at that chart. Not shocked. More like finally seeing something clearly that I'd been squinting at for years. I told Weston that night. He was at my kitchen table when I got home, reading something on his laptop, and I sat down across from him and just told him all of it. The chart, the font, the eucalyptus sprigs. He closed the laptop. "Do you want to skip it?" he asked. I thought about it for longer than I expected to. "No," I said. "I need to go, not to make a point. I just need to see it one more time clearly, and then I'm done pretending I didn't see it." He was quiet for a moment. "Then I'll be there." We arrived on time. Weston wore a dark navy jacket over a simple shirt. I wore a green dress I'd owned for 3 years that I knew looked good on me. Not the beige thing my mother had messaged me. A photo of 2 weeks earlier with the caption, "Something like this might be more appropriate for the venue." My parents greeted us near the entrance. My father shook Weston's hand the way you shake the hand of someone you're not planning to remember. My mother touched my arm and glanced at the dress once. Table 17 was exactly what the chart had promised. A plain white pillar candle in a clear holder. Name cards in standard print. The view from our seats was a direct line to the swing door of the catering corridor. Garrett Sloan was at table 1. Silver-haired, relaxed in the way wealthy people get when they've stopped needing to prove anything. He shook my father's hand at the start of the evening, and I watched my father's whole body get 2 degrees taller. The first time Sloan glanced across the room, I thought it was random. The second time, his gaze settled on Weston and didn't move for a moment before he looked away. The third time, he stopped looking away. Something moved across his face. A pause, a stillness. then a recognition that rearranged everything. My father tapped his glass for the toast about 40 minutes into the evening. He was good at this, commanding attention without demanding it, making the room feel grateful to be listening. He talked about what it meant to build something lasting, about the 15 years of HPG, about my grandfather's original vision. He talked about Drew with the specific, detailed pride of someone who has been keeping score for decades. He talked about the partnership announcement. Then he looked at me. That particular look, the one that manages to be affectionate and diminishing at the same time, the one I had been on the receiving end of for 8 years. "My daughter Evelyn is with us tonight," he said warmly. "She teaches 2nd grade, which, we always say in this family, takes a kind of patience the rest of us simply don't have." He smiled. Laughter, soft, from a few tables nearby. "And she's brought her partner, Weston, is it? Who does some kind of conservation work. Out in the field, literally." More laughter. He looked directly at me. "Still out there saving the land?" The smile beneath that question was the same one I'd been watching my whole life. I didn't answer. I picked up my water glass and set it back down. About 150 people were oriented in my direction. Weston stood up. The room noticed it, the way rooms notice when someone unexpectedly occupies space. Not loud, not dramatic, just a physical shift that changed what the room was looking at. Garrett Sloan was already on his feet. He crossed from table 1 without hurrying. The whole room watched him do it. Watched the most important guest at the party walk, toward the back corner, toward the table with the plain candle and the generic name cards, and I saw my father's smile slip for the first time all evening. Sloan stopped at our table. His voice was measured, but the room was already quiet. "Weston," he said, "I thought that was you. I didn't realize." He looked at me briefly, then at my parents with an expression I recognized. The expression of someone deciding how direct to be. "Warren," he said to my father, "you know this man." My father's voice came out careful. "He's Evelyn's. He works in conservation, I believe." Sloan nodded slowly. "He does. He let that land." Weston Hale chairs the Sonoran Valley Environmental Foundation, $17 million in protected land across 4 counties in the last 3 years alone. He's also the reason the state's rural school infrastructure grant even exists. He drafted the proposal and pushed it through the legislature. 4 rural schools got rebuilt because of that. He turned down a seat on the governor's education advisory panel twice. Both times he said the same thing. The work is on the ground, not in meetings. He looked at Weston with something close to genuine respect. He's also, as of last quarter, the reason Western Apex's sustainability compliance framework actually holds up in this state. A beat. He consulted on the legal structure. Pro bono. My father opened his mouth. Nothing came out. The room was completely still. Weston didn't raise his voice. He looked at my father and then at my mother, and then at the 150 people seated between them. "I didn't come tonight to complicate anyone's evening," he said. "I came because Evelyn asked me to, and because she is the most genuinely good person I have ever known. She spends her days teaching children that they are capable of more than they think. She does it for $38,000 a year in a district that doesn't have enough books. She does it without anyone in this room ever asking her about it, and she has spent the last 8 years being introduced like a footnote to a story her family decided wasn't worth telling." He looked at my father steadily. "You've never asked my last name. In 14 months, it never came up. That's a choice, and it tells me exactly what standard you were measuring me against." He sat down. Silence. Then I stood up. I was not going to cry. I had decided that somewhere around table 7 on Garrett Sloan's walk across the room. "I've been letting you summarize me for 8 years, I said to my parents. My voice was level. In introductions and conversations, in every room where you mentioned Drew's name first and then remembered mine. In every table assignment that told me exactly where I stood without anyone having to say it out loud." My mother was looking at the tablecloth. "I'm not performing anything right now. I'm not here to make a scene. I'm just telling you that I see it, and I've always seen it, and I'm done arranging myself to take up less space so you don't have to explain me. I looked at Weston. Let's go. We walked out, unhurried. Past tables 1 through 4, past the eucalyptus place cards, past the string quartet that had stopped playing. 150 people watched us leave, and no one said a word. The drive home was quiet for a while, not uncomfortable. The kind of quiet that comes after something has finally been said. Drew called the next morning. He didn't start with an apology. He started with "Dad's in a bad place," which told me where his loyalties still lived. I let him finish, and then I told him I was glad he'd called and that I needed some time, and I said it in the same voice I use when a student needs a boundary held with kindness but without movement. He didn't call back that week. Garrett Sloan, as I found out through a series of phone calls I wasn't part of, had quietly let my father know that Western Apex would be pausing the acquisition discussions. Not canceling. Pausing. To reassess cultural alignment. Those were the words my father relayed to me later. Cultural alignment. In real estate terms, that meant the 7-month negotiation had effectively been suspended and the window for that deal was closing. 2 of my father's colleagues from the Arizona Commercial Real Estate Council sent messages within the following week, politely worded. One cited a scheduling conflict for a committee my father had expected to chair. The other didn't give a reason at all. My mother called on a Thursday 12 days after the gala. "Can we have you over for dinner?" she said. "Your father and I both want to talk." I asked her the same thing I'd been asking myself for a week. Do they want to talk, or do they want the situation to stop? She was quiet for longer than I expected. "Both," she said finally, "and I know how that sounds. But I've been thinking about what you said. About the introductions. I've been thinking about it since that night, and I don't think I realized. I think I knew, and I didn't let myself finish the thought. That's different from not knowing, and it's worse." Her voice had something in it I hadn't heard before. Not guilt, exactly. Something more like the particular tiredness of someone who has been carrying a justification for a long time and finally set it down. I told her I would come. I told her what it would take. A series of family sessions with a therapist, beginning with a session where I spoke about the last 8 years without being interrupted, contextualized, or redirected. 1 hour. My words, in full, in that room. She didn't negotiate, she said yes. The first session was in a small office near Camelback Road. Cream walls, low bookshelves, a therapist named Dr. Osei who had the particular skill of occupying a room without filling it. My father sat across from me. He was smaller somehow than I'd ever seen him. Not diminished exactly. More like the first time you see a building you've always been afraid of in the daylight and realize it's just a building. I talked for 52 minutes. I talked about the introductions. About Table 17. About the thumbs up emoji. About the 8 years of detour. About the student who read his first sentence and what it felt like to be the person in the room for that moment. About what it costs me, slowly, over years, to keep showing up to a family that had already decided what I was worth. My father did not interrupt. He looked at the carpet for most of it. When I finished, he looked up, and he said, "I think I've been afraid that if your work mattered, I would have to ask why I didn't make room for it." And I wasn't ready to answer that. That sentence cost him something. I heard it in the way he said it. It didn't fix 8 years. Nothing was going to do that in the Thursday afternoon. But it was a real sentence, not a managed one, and that was more than I had expected. We've been to 6 sessions since then. Some of them moved us forward. Some of them we just sat in the room together and did the work of not leaving, which is its own kind of progress. Drew came to the 4th session. He sat next to my mother and said very little, but he came, and that was a choice. And choices tell you more than anything else does. Weston was at his kitchen table when I got home from that first session. He looked up when I came in, and I sat across from him, and I said, "I think it's going to be okay, not fixed, but okay." He nodded, like he'd been waiting for exactly that answer and nothing else. I've thought a lot about what the gala clarified. Not just about my family, but about the way we read people. Weston drove a 10-year-old Subaru with a broken handle on his tote bag and turned down advisory panels and never told me a single thing about the SVF because I never asked in a way that made him think I needed to know for any reason other than genuine curiosity. He would have been the same person if Garrett Sloan had stayed at table 1 all night. He was the same person. That's the point. I spent years making my work legible to people who had already written the caption. After a while, you stop explaining and just live inside the gap between what you are and what they've decided to see. That gap gets heavy. Teaching second grade is not a detour. It is not admirable in the way people use that word to mean noble but small. It is the work of being present, daily, for human beings at the most formative point of their cognitive lives. I have watched children arrive in September who cannot hold a pencil correctly and leave in June reading chapter books. I have watched a child whose home life I will not describe here come into my classroom and understand, sometimes for the first time in his day, that he is capable and that someone is glad he showed up. That is not a footnote, that is the whole story. Weston told me something once, early on, when I was explaining why I'd gone into teaching instead of what my family had hoped for. He listened all the way through and then he said, "It sounds like you went toward something, not away." I've been thinking about that for 14 months. Is there someone in your life you've already written the caption for before you knew enough to write anything at all? There's a moment in that first therapy session I keep coming back to. Not the part where I finally said everything out loud. Though that mattered more than I expected, the part that stays with me is smaller. It's my father looking at the carpet while I talked and then looking up and saying something true instead of something managed. I didn't know he had that in him. 8 years of evidence had pointed the other direction. What I've come to understand is that the evening at the Biltmore didn't change my father. It removed the insulation that had kept him from having to look directly at what he'd been doing. People don't usually change because they're caught. They change, if they change at all, because the cost of not changing finally becomes real to them. That's not karma in any mystical sense. It's just the natural consequence of choices accumulating until they're too heavy to carry quietly. My father had been making small choices for 8 years. The pause before my name, the table assignment, the thumbs up emoji, and each one felt manageable on its own. Together, they built something that eventually had to be accounted for. Weston never needed anyone to validate what he was doing. He turned down advisory panels not out of false modesty, but because he genuinely believed the work was in the field, not in the meeting room. That kind of clarity, knowing what you're for and not needing it confirmed by the right people in the right rooms, is something I've thought about a lot. It takes a specific kind of intelligence to see through the performance of status. And it takes something beyond intelligence, something more like the willingness to keep doing the right thing in the right way, even when no one at table 1 is watching. I spent years performing legibility for people who had already made up their minds, explaining my work in the language I thought they'd respect, softening the edges of what I did so it would fit more comfortably into their version of ambition. That's its own kind of cost. Not just the energy it takes, but what it does to your sense of your own worth over time. You start measuring yourself against the standard of people who don't understand what you're measuring. What I taught myself, slowly and then all at once that night, is that showing up anyway is not weakness. Going to that gala, knowing what table 17 meant, saying what I said with my voice level and my legs not entirely steady, that required something. Not bravado, something quieter and harder than that. The willingness to see clearly and still choose not to look away. I think about my students sometimes when I think about all of this, the ones who arrive in September convinced they can't do the thing and leave in June having done it. What changed wasn't their ability. What changed was their willingness to keep going through the part where they didn't know yet if it would work. That persistence, not the showy kind, but the daily, unglamorous, showing up kind, is what I try to build in them. It's also what I had to find in myself. My father is learning something similar, I think. It's slower at 62 than it is at 7. But the sessions continue, and he keeps coming, and some weeks we move forward, and some weeks we just sit in the room and don't leave, which is, as it turns out, its own form of progress.